ecology, behavior, and evolution of frogs, reptiles, birds, plants, and marine fauna. He has established research programs on different species of sea turtles and elasmobranchs along the Indian coast. Professor Kartik is a founding trustee of Dakshin Foundation, where he oversees work on marine flagships and community well-being, and a founding editor of the magazine Current Conservation. He is the author of the book From Soup to Superstar, a historical account of sea turtle conservation in India, and several children's books. The title for Professor Kartik's talk is Evolution in an Escarpment: Why Are There So Many Species of Frogs and Reptiles in the Western Ghats?
Is this on? Can you hear me? Can you? Yeah. All right. Great. Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks so much to Praphul for inviting me. I'm going to be talking a little bit about what people generally call creepy crawlies, and some of us had the good fortune to be introduced to them in our youth, and then never stopped running after them. So we do a few different things. I do a few different things. I work on, a lot of my work is on marine turtles around the country and sea turtle conservation. A lot of my work through the NGO Dakshin Foundation is on working on coastal and marine conservation, both with flagship species like sea turtles as well as with coastal communities. And in a way, a lot of the work that I do on conservation and sustainability and with people is in that sphere. Today, however, I'm going to be talking about something a little bit more arcane, a little bit perhaps removed directly from the questions about conservation and sustainability we may think of, but they are deeply connected because that knowledge provides us an understanding with which to go forward. Okay, so when we start thinking about biodiversity on Earth, if you look at a simple map of the diversity of any group, and the examples that I have over here are frogs and fish, and in both cases, in both cases you'll see something very similar. You see that there's like a, rich reddish lines in South America, Central America, large parts of Central Africa, and South Asia and Southeast Asia, and so on. And if you just think about it for a second, you would realize that these are the tropics. And the widespread pattern of species diversity across the Earth is that you get more species in the tropics. And for close to 200 years now, or 300 years I should say, naturalists have wondered about why this is so. Everyone knows about Linnaeus as the father of taxonomy and so on, but Linnaeus himself wondered about why there are more species of flora and fauna in the warmer parts of the Earth. A lovely Linnaeus story is that in those days, as you might imagine, people believed that 4,000 years ago, the world was created 4,000 years ago, there was a flood, and Noah came along with his ark and rescued all the plants and animals and then redistributed them across the Earth. Linnaeus, because of his predecessors and so on, they had started to believe that the story of the ark wasn't literally true, but he still wanted to believe it. So he came up with the idea that a mountain was the metaphor for an ark, and all the tropical species were at the base of the mountain, and all the temperate species were at the top of the mountain. And what was written in the Bible as Noah's Ark was actually a mountain, and this was his theory of biogeography that combined the ecology he knew and the Bible he believed in. So this has been a burning question for a very, very long time, and as we get as more and more information accumulated about plants and animals on the Earth, people realize that not just is this diversity in the tropics, but even within the tropics, it's not evenly distributed. As you can see, there are some areas within the tropics that have much, much higher diversity. Another very interesting pattern is that diversity is also not equally distributed across the tree of life, right? So you have species like these tuataras, which are 200 million years old and found in New Zealand. And there's just one or maybe two species of these today. And I'll give you some examples from the Western Ghats as we go along, where over 100 million years, that entire group of animals just has one species. Then you take something like birds, which evolved about 100 something million years ago, or snakes. Birds have 10,000 species. Snakes have 4,000 species. So why is it that some groups have, in the same amount, the same 100 to 150 million years, evolved into 4,000 species or 10,000, and the other one just sat there, like somebody from management and didn't change for 100 million years? Apologies to any managers here. It's a safe joke to make. Well, I could also say the same thing about academics in academic company. So the question we end up asking ourselves is, why is the diversity of some clades greater? And the answer sort of lies in what we call in understanding what we call evolutionary radiations, where there's tremendous diversification of some taxa within a small spatial area. And so these global examples that people have written about for, again, more than a century, you have Hawaiian honey creepers, these Caribbean lizards, cichlid fish, trees and birds in Madagascar and so on. And these are sort of a setting for us to try and understand what processes lead to there being so many species, within these small areas that might explain these patterns at a larger global scale. So that sort of brings us to the Western Ghats. This is my lab, as I like to say. I think all the speakers you've heard this morning, we have the pleasure of being able to say we may have tiny rooms, but we have large labs. And the groups that I got, some of the groups of frogs that you find here that we got really interested in. Just to give you an example, these are these tiny bush frogs that are about yay big on the average, and they have these amazing shapes, colors, and forms. And you can contrast them with another group that's called of wrinkled frogs or night frogs, that all of them, despite all of these being different species, look more or less the same. And it sort of left us with these questions of A, why are there so many species, but B, how does this come about? So about 15 years ago, along with a bunch of my students and later postdocs and so on, we embarked on this journey of discovery in the Western Ghats. And even before starting our sampling, we kind of took into consideration, or we made it part of our exploratory procedure. We thought about how do different species come, what do we know about how different species come about in the first place, in a very general sense, right? And species are believed to come about by three processes. The most common one is what is geographical separation. We won't worry about the terms. Geographical separation, when there's a barrier, between two populations of the same species. Over millions of years, they stop exchanging genes, and like, for example, those two frogs on the mountaintop, and they eventually become two different species. The student who worked on this was giving a talk to 5-year-olds once, and he had exactly this picture. And as you can see, I have pictures of real frogs over there, right? And so the 5-year-old puts up a hand and said, how did you get a picture of a frog that lived 10 million years ago, right? And totally stumped him. He used words like, I think he said hypothetical and blah, blah, and blah, blah. And then I put my hand up and said imaginary. So, but we hypothesized what existed several million years ago using the same kind of methods that I think Dr. Umar Ramakrishnan would have talked to you about in the morning, and arrive at inferences like these. But again, hypothetically, they can either divide based on a geographical divide, or an environmental gradient, such as the top of a mountain to the bottom of a mountain, and those environmental gradients lead eventually to those populations not adapting to different environments, not exchanging genes, becoming different species. And sometimes they can become different species in the same geographical location. Fairly rare in vertebrates, more common in a few invertebrates, but we won't think too much about that right now. Often it comes about by genetic mechanisms, chromosomal changes, and so on. So keeping this in account, we went about sampling the entire Western Ghats. And I say we, it's really an army of students, researchers, and postdocs. And because we knew how species may come about, we sampled all of these mountains because we knew the tops of these the valleys may be acting as barriers. And we also sampled all of the elevational gradients because, as I said, the environmental gradients may result in different species forming. And then we also sampled different vegetations because we knew that there might be environmental gradients across those different vegetation, rainfall gradients and so on. So we said if species are forming by these processes that we understand, the fundamental processes, then this is where we need to be looking, right? So there was a large body of work over perhaps about 10, 12 years of field work. And what did we find? Unsurprisingly, the first thing we found was lots of new species. And we weren't the only ones. Many herpetologists, people working on amphibians and reptiles in the last 15 to 20 years, the number of species of frogs in the Western Ghats, when I was a student, was about 100. Today there are about 250. The group bush frogs that I'm talking about, I was interested in working on it for my PhD, and there were 15 species of bush frogs then, and I had trouble even identifying those 15 species, and so I gave up on that project. But there are 60 species of bush frogs today, right? So every group that you look at, the number of species has grown up dramatically, and we've contributed to some part of that discovery. So my student Vijay Kumar described 9 species of bush frogs. Another student described 12 species of these day geckos, which are one of the species you find very commonly in Bangalore as well. It's called Nemaspis mysorensis. It's not a normal, the house geckos, but actually some 30-odd new species of day geckos have been described from peninsular India in the last few years. Many new species of these common vine snakes, many new species of pit vipers, and so on. Now, the interesting thing about all of this, the first kind of message that to take away from this is that, going forward again. In each of these groups, many of the new species we found were actually separated from other species by being on mountains and separated by valleys. So you had what are called sister species. Me and my sister, my closest relative, would be either on top or in the middle of 2 mountains, but separated from another species, essentially by some sort of barrier. Occasionally by an environmental gradient, occasionally top of a mountain, bottom of a mountain, but most frequently by these barriers. So you go to every such group. Day gecko is a little more confusing, but a similar pattern. Vine snakes, there was the common species of vine snake that was believed to be just one species across the Western Ghats. We find one south of the Shenkota Gap, one between the Palghat Gap, which is another very deep divide in the Western Ghats, and one north of the Palghat Gap. Same pattern with pit vipers. This common Malabar pit viper, which was thought to be the same species across the entire Western Ghats, turns out to be 4 species, again divided by these deep valleys. So the same pattern over and over again, which of course then you infer from that one of the processes by which the speciation is taking place is these barriers, right? But that was not the whole story. Like those 2 ataras, we did have this one frog, which is a relative of that wrinkled frog, which has 40 plus species, just one species in the entire Western Ghats, in fact belonging to its own genus. Similarly, an ancestor of the vine snakes, which was again discovered from the southern Western Ghats, just a single species in the entire Western Ghats. So again, even though we found these new species by using this underlying evolutionary process, we're still left with this question of why some diversify so much and others do not. So then we ask the question, how do they diversify? And one of the first answers comes from these bush frogs, and again from Vijay Kumar's work. And the 2 significant patterns that we found. One is it's not just the species, but these large groups themselves, dating back to 20 million years ago, are separated by this Palghat Gap. So if you go back 20 million years in time, you find that the Palghat Gap has separated species north and groups north and south. Now this is very interesting. This Palghat Gap is interesting because Professor Sukuma, whom you heard in the morning, may not have talked about elephants much, but one of the first genetic studies showed that elephants south and north of the Palghat Gap show some differences from each other, which is a few 100,000 years. Then you find species that were 1 million years apart that are separated by the Palghat Gap. You go 20 million years back, you find entire what we call groups of species or clades that are separated by the Palghat Gap. So this Palghat Gap is this barrier that's acting at this orders of magnitude, 100,000 years, 1 million years, 25 million years. It's separating species at, it's a barrier to evolutionary groups at all of these spatial scales. Why is that important? Because the north and the south of the Palghat Gap haven't had the same climatic history. And climatic changes, especially during the glaciations, which affected the northern Western Ghats more, and the southern Western Ghats retained their forests, served as refuges for these species, and they could survive over here. This is one of the reasons why certain parts of the world are called museums, because they serve as museums for species that have lived long ago. But on the other hand, species are also evolving over here, as we saw, and so it can also be considered as a cradle. And that's also reflected in the kind of canopy that you get in the north and the south. You get all these bush frogs that you see in the canopy in the southern Western Ghats, and you don't see them in the north at all. So these sort of differences in climate, in vegetation, in climatic history resulted in there being a different consequence for these bush frogs in the southern Western Ghats, and led to these differences that we see today. So the other group that we're really interested in are these wrinkled frogs that we talked about, and they live in streams, and we decided to compare these three groups of stream-dwelling frogs. These are these tiny frogs that call during the day. They're very interesting. They have this behavior called foot flagging, because they live in these noisy streams. They come, and during the day, they kick their feet out to attract females. And then there's these very common frogs in streams across the Western Ghats. And what we found in each of these groups every time we visited, and a lot of the questions that we ask actually come from natural history. So, we're going to the Western Ghats year after year, and from the first visits with one of my students 20 years ago, we were looking at each other and we said, have you noticed that every time we go to a stream, we get this Nyctibatrachus, or this wrinkled frog, we get a medium one, a small one, and a giant one. Then as we started doing surveys, we realized that sometimes you get a super tiny and a super giant as well. But you almost never get two Nyctibatrachus frogs of the same size in these streams. So we then said, is this true of all of these stream frogs? And we found that it was also somewhat true of this, of these dancing frogs, which I show those pictures of. You get a small and a large one. Not as many species, but you get the small and the large. So we became quite intrigued by this, and we used again these the sequences and genetic analysis and phylogenetic trees. And what we found using this was that body size actually evolves differences in body size evolve very early. So very early in the evolution of these groups, which ranges from about 30 to 60 million years, very early in that evolution, some two frogs diversified in size. And that size diversity allowed them to coexist and of course occupy new habitats. And because competition will prevent two species from, very simplistically put, will prevent species from similar niches from coexisting, because they might compete, but the difference in sizes perhaps allowed these two frogs to diversify so greatly. And as you can see over here also, the species with the greater frog diversity also has far greater diversity across the Western Ghats. Nyctibatrachus, you get 4 or 5 different sizes. There are 40 to 50 species. Micrixalis, you get these largely two sizes, and you get about 15 to 20 species. Of course, the body size was also related with habitat, which also allows the species to occupy the middle of the stream, the side of the stream, the forest floor, and so on, whereas the other species are restricted to the stream itself. And with the frogs that didn't show a size difference, which these one of the groups that we were looking at, the way that they diversified was that one occupied still water and one occupied moving water. So the ways that these species are able to evolve and diversify is either adapting and having what people call an evolutionary innovation. With birds, it was wings. With snakes, it was their, the loss of limbs and their ability to be predators of a certain kind, occupy certain habitats. With two of these groups of frogs, it's body size diversification, and with one of them, it's habitat diversification. My last story is that this has started telling us something about how species evolve and diversify within the Western Ghats, right? So they got here, and through evolutionary time, all of these processes have led to there being so many different species today. But that's not the entire story. If you look at a group of lizards called calotis, which are the common garden lizards, what you find within this large group of these garden lizards, this large clade of garden lizards, is that you get two different origin stories within the Western Ghats. One origin story is I was born here. My great-great-grandfather species was born here 20 million years ago, and split and became many species. The other, which you don't find as commonly in those frogs that I talked about, is that my great-great-grandfather had a cousin in Southeast Asia somewhere, and his descendants, migrated here. And this is a very common process in biogeographic history, because over hundreds of millions of years, species have to get from point A to point B. That's how the world was colonized. So, but if you look at these smaller areas and specific groups, you find some groups like frogs where you don't find such an imprint of dispersal or migration being a cause of those species being there. But these lizards, you find descendants of species that originated in the Ghats and descendant of species that arrived over here, dispersing across South Asia through Northeast India and to here. The groups of snakes that I talked about, you see very similar patterns. You see an entire set of species that evolved here, and then you see another set of species that arrived over here. So another question that we ask ourselves often is, when you see a particular pattern of diversity, how much of it is explained by the ecology of the process, that is, the suitability of the environment, how much is because of the evolutionary processes that occurred over there, and how much of it is because species arrived from somewhere in evolutionary time. All of that results in these patterns that we see in the same part of the same project, in the same fieldwork. We also generated data on where species are found, obviously, and so that gives us an account of where these species are found. And you can see this rich concentration of amphibians. These are frogs, lizards, and snakes in the southern Western Ghats. This is a combination of being a consequence of suitable ecological conditions and the evolutionary history that is of the Western Ghats being a center of diversification. You see less of this pattern in birds, for example, just as a contrast, and you see bird diversity being quite high all the way to the central Western Ghats. And as you can imagine, this is because birds can travel greater distances. Sometimes ecology is as simple as that. Anyway, so to sort of summarize that story, we used fundamental principles of evolution to try and understand biogeography itself, and that really helped us discover, I think, right now, probably something like 40 to 50 new species of frogs, lizards, and snakes from our labs and collaborators itself, and many, many more across research groups. The frogs and lizard communities in the Western Ghats are a combination of both species arriving from elsewhere through dispersal and processes that are happening here, evolution at home. And these processes are strongly affected by things like by geology, by the Palgard Gap, as I've emphasized many times. This is a cause of evolutionary lineages or different species splitting and becoming new species. There are traits, what we call these evolutionary things that give them an evolutionary advantage that have allowed rapid diversification in those groups. Historical climate, such as glaciation, that made some parts of the Western Ghats more suitable over the last few million years. And finally, the fact that both ecology and evolution influence the patterns that we see today. I just want to finish saying in closing that as I said, this really is about ecology and evolution. However, for us to now determine where we want to prioritize our conservation efforts, firstly, it's of course where species are, but it's also where endemic species are. Where are the rare species? Where are the species that are rich evolutionarily, right? So if I, in a very crude way, if I had to prioritize the tuatara and a bird, the tuatara trumps, well, they're probably birds that are equally evolutionarily ancient, but it trumps most birds. I mean, because if one species of bird goes extinct, there's another one that's very closely related to it, just as an either or option, right? But the tuatara, there's just one single one of its kind in the whole world, right? So we also have to incorporate this knowledge of evolutionary history into our conservation sort of prioritization frameworks, and understanding both the ecology and evolution helps us make those decisions. I don't want to give too much importance to those decisions, because at the end of the day, conservation sustainability is a socio-political process, and it has much more to do with economics, society, and governance than it has to do with the things we do. But nevertheless, we can make a small contribution to making those decisions. Just to acknowledge, numerous PhD students and postdocs and state departments and funding agencies. In particular, these folks who worked on all of those frogs, snakes, and lizards that I talked about today. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech, sir. Any questions we have?
Yeah, insightful lecture, Kartik sir. This is Dr. Pasha from National Institute of Advanced Studies. So I have a small query, and I want to get some insight from this. Lizard richness map you have showed, no? So what is the grid size of that lizard richness map, number one? And have you identified, mapped the native forest versus the planted vegetation or planted forest, and how this distribution is matters?
I'll answer the first one first. There is we didn't map vegetation, but there's lots of vegetation maps for the Western Ghats. Numerous different groups have actually, like the French Institute, the NGO A-Tree, which is Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment, and other agencies have, both through a combination of field surveys as well as remote sensing, have created many vegetation layers for the Western Ghats. Many of which are publicly available as well. I think India Biodiversity Portal might be a good place to go and look for those layers. Those layers are independently available. Those maps are essentially what are called interpolated maps, which is that we have data for a certain number of cells, and then we opposite of extrapolate, we interpolate the data for the remaining cells. The resolution at which we map it varies depending on the analysis that we're doing. So there are some, if we are comparing it with environmental layers that are available at 1 degree, we would remap it at a degree and analyze it at that scale, or we can map it at one square kilometer, all depending on the analytical question you're asking. The data itself comes from field surveys, across the Ghats, and that data was not collected by using a grid cell of a particular size.
Okay, thank you. No, my question is 1 degree is almost 111 kilometers. Within that, we can have the different landscape, like a planted ecosystem, for example, rubber and this one, and a natural ecosystem. Most of the collection from the natural forest integrity. So we will take the information from natural forest, but we are not separated. As a grid, we are representing both landscape.
Sure, that is the problem. See,
yes.
The problem is actually getting the environmental data at 1 square kilometer resolutions.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the mapping now has been done at a much finer resolution for vegetation and environment.
Yeah.
So I think, a lot of the analysis that I see being done, spatial analysis, is done at 1 square kilometer resolution, which is, of course, much better than doing it at 1 degree.
Yeah, we released a data on 30 meter for entire India. Myself and Professor Dadwal, we released that and published that data.
That's great. Good to know.
Recently. Thank you.
Professor Shankar here. Just on a slightly different, in the interest of safety to you and your team, do you carry anti-venom kits when you go to all these forest expeditions?
No.
It's important. How do you protect yourselves?
How do you protect? No. So, well, the chances of getting bitten by a venomous snake, if you're actually not trying to catch one, are very, very small. I know of almost no cases of people of ecologists that got bitten by a venomous snake by accident. All envenomation is by people handling snakes or people in agricultural fields stepping on them. That's where the 1 million snake bites comes largely from sort of rural and whatever populations, right? So, so my anti-venom kit is don't handle venomous snakes. I mean, unless it's part of your project. I had a student who's, well, I shouldn't say student. I had one of India's, king cobra experts, Dr. Kartik Shanker, do his PhD in association with my lab. Well, I obviously couldn't give him that advice, but Gauri is an expert snake handler, and they do operate. Well, increasingly, if there are students working on venomous snakes, we try and ensure that we know where the nearest, antivenom is stored, and that's pretty much the. Storing antivenom, administering antivenom. There's one of my colleagues in the same department that Professor Saskia and I work at, Dr. Kartik Shanker works on venom. And his whole work is on how bad Indian antivenom is. So a lot of the time administering it, people actually die from or have, symptoms of, are affected by the antivenom itself. Right? And so
there may be variation in venoms and antivenoms.
Yeah, that's what he works on. Yeah. And so and they're not because of impurities and so on, they cause all kinds of other reactions, and so that's a reason that antivenom in any case should not be administered without supervision.
Just curious, on there poisonous frogs and lizards also?
There are
no. Mapping.
So not any of the ones that we work with. Some of the lizards have. I don't know if you have back-fanged lizards. So some of the snakes as well and lizards have, they call back-fanged, and they sort of inject venom into the prey when they're swallowing them. So the front tooth bites rarely envenomate, but we don't have poisonous frogs or venomous lizards that I would worry about.
Thank you.
We also, so the other thing is that, there should be greater, we always advocate for greater safety, but you also have to, recall that we all started catching snakes, including venomous snakes, in the great tradition of Romulus Whittaker, who had access to nothing, right? And so when people in my generation and probably in the next generation, the only thing that the message that we took away was the two things that you have to know about handling snakes is you have to know which one is venomous and which one is not, so that you're more careful with venomous snakes, and then you have to want to do it, and you do it with extreme caution. And those are the first principles we all applied. I had no supervision when I caught my first cobra or Russell's viper or any of those things, and I don't advocate that to my students anymore. But I'm just saying that herpetologists have grown up with this sort of almost oral tradition of snake catching, and the only known king cobra deaths are selfie deaths. These are snake cobra rescuers, trying to take selfies while holding on to a snake. So the greatest threat to snake catchers is not the snake, but Instagram.
Kartik, nice talk. Yeah. So I don't know whether you would have done it or some other people have done. I mean, one thing was very clear that the diversification that you have in frogs is very, very distinct. And one also knows that in case of amphibians, the genome content varies more than 100-fold from one frog to maybe another frog, which is very different than, let's say, if you compare the genome size of human versus mice. Which is very similar. So do you think that this genome content somehow contributes to this very distinct phenotypes that you have in different frogs? Or have you looked at any of that?
this is why it's dangerous to have molecular biologists in your audience. The straight answer to that question is Professor Vashni is a very, very senior colleague of mine from IISc. So I really feel like I'm answering a comprehensive exam question. I don't know. No, the truth is I actually don't know. But what I could say very quickly is I'd be intrigued to go and look up to see whether the differences within anurans as well, or whether the differences between anurans and salamanders and so on. Because those groups are really widely divergent. Now, even within anurans, if there is a wide difference in genome content, nevertheless, the groups that I'm comparing are very close, right? So the Astrobatrachus, which has 1 species, is very closely related to Nyctibatrachus, which has 45 species, right? Prohetula, which has 1 species, very closely related to Hetula. So I I could be mistaken, but my expectation would not be such varied variation.
It might be interesting to look at.
No, absolutely. Like I said, my basic answer to the question is I don't know, but it would be interesting to examine, yeah.
Particularly the one where you have, different sizes of the
Yeah,
frogs, sort of coexisting.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I request Kaushik to share a token of our gratitude for being here and giving your time to talk to us. Our last speaker for today is Professor Praphul Chandra. Professor Praphul Chandra is at Atria University, and with over 25 years of experience in research and development, Dr. Chandra holds a PhD in game theory and mechanism design from the Indian Institute of Science, an MS in electrical engineering from Columbia University, a PG diploma in policy studies from University of London, and a BTech in electronics engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology. His professional journey includes roles such as founder and CEO at CoinEarth, professor of machine learning at Golden Gate University, and senior research scientist at Hewlett-Packard. Dr. Chandra has authored 2 books, 4 book chapters, and over 36 publications. He currently serves as Accenture Luminary and Director of the Atria Center of Excellence in AI and Decentralized Technologies. Dr. Praphul will be speaking on the Earth Stack, a digital public infrastructure for natural capital.
So while this is coming up, I was thinking about the day-to-day. We have had a physicist speak. We have had a botanist speak. We have had an ecologist speak. And now you're going to see a computer scientist speak. And I think over lunch, me and Kaushik were talking. And computer scientists have the curse of jumping to saying, how do we solve the problem? Right? And what you're going to see is an attempt at saying, how do we solve the problem that we are facing today? My background, as I said, is in game theory. In fact, my PhD guide was Professor Narhari at the Indian Institute of Science. And I'm going to take an attempt at explaining to you how we are excited about this idea called the Earth Stack. Right? Many of you probably may not know what I'm talking about when I say digital public infrastructure. And therefore, it is prudent for me to start this by explaining what I'm talking about. Right? A lot of you, I assume all of you would have seen this. This is called the Aadhaar card. Right? And I'm assuming a lot of you have this. The Aadhaar card was an initiative which started in 2010 when the journey was initiated by a motivation of giving every Indian an ID. Now, in of itself, the idea of having an ID for citizens and residents of a country is not new. What was new was the way the solution was built. Right? There's a whole digital infrastructure that India has built which supports Aadhaar. Right? What is unique about Aadhaar is that it is linked to your biometric and demographic identity. What that means is that if you walk into a bank or a hospital and you offer your thumbprint and your Aadhaar identity, the bank or the healthcare institution can very quickly check who you are. Right? And this took a few years to build. And over a period of time, there is a whole set of solutions and services which has been built on top of Aadhaar. Right? Whether it's eKYC, which your bank uses, whether it's digital signatures that you can do, whether it's UPI, which you are using today with Google Pay and PhonePe, all of them are built on top of this digital infrastructure. Right? I use the word infrastructure, and then the people who have been working on this technology use the word infrastructure very, very consciously. When we think about infrastructure, traditionally, we think about physical infrastructure like roads and bridges. And if you take a moment to think about what infrastructure does, when the government builds a road to connecting a new town or a village, it leads to the development of a lot of the economy where the road is reaching. Right? So infrastructure is considered an enabler of economic growth. And similarly, the digital infrastructure that we are talking about today is a set of interoperable standards, whether they are used for digital identity or payments or data sharing or e-commerce, but these now are well recognized as real infrastructure enablers for growth in any country, right? Because both of them, whether it's physical or digital, these infrastructures drive both private and public innovation. So, and these have been hugely successful, right? We had one of the architects of the digital public infrastructure come and talk to us a few weeks ago at Atria. And this is a slide that I took from his lecture. Just to give you an idea of how powerful the impact of these technologies has been, I think this is a good metric, right? What we achieved in 9 years in terms of financial inclusion in India would have otherwise taken 47 years to achieve. Right? And that's a huge saving in terms of how quickly the country grows. Right? So in this diagram, what you're seeing is GDP per capita on the horizontal axis and the number of adults with bank accounts on the vertical axis. Right? Now, if we did not have the digital public infrastructure of Aadhaar and UPI, it would have taken us 47 years to get to the level of financial inclusion that we are at today. Right? So you can see the impact that digital infrastructure can have on the ground. Right? Now, this idea of digital public infrastructure, which kind of was, India was one of the originators of this idea, has now gone over and beyond, right? And it's now a track in the United Nations. In fact, there was a dedicated set of sessions on digital public infrastructure when India hosted the G20 summit, right? And I like this definition of digital public infrastructure that United Nations has put up, that it's a shared means to many ends, right? This also brings me to why I'm talking about digital technology in a forum where we are talking about biodiversity, biogeography, and conservation, right? And I think one place to start is the United Nations Biodiversity Lab, right? This is a digital public infrastructure which has been recognized as a global digital public infrastructure. And it combines satellite imagery with environmental data sets to help countries monitor and report on the goals that they are trying to achieve with regards to biodiversity and sustainable development goals, right? So all of us have seen what Aadhaar looks like. This is what UN Biodiversity Lab looks like, right? It's, as I said, a collection of satellite imagery combined with environmental data sets gathered from around the world This is of course an India specific view, but you can look at it any part of the world for this. And on the left hand side, you will see different kinds of data set related to biodiversity that have been gathered. Right? And this, as you start to see, is an effort to bring together solutions, and something that Professor Kartik talked about, right? Conservation is a economical, social, and governance problem, right? So you'll see attempts at how computer scientists start to look at saying, well, there's a problem, let's see how we can solve it, and this is one thing that they are beginning to do. But my reason to talk to you about biodiversity and digital public infrastructure together is twofold. One, you are seeing efforts like this already happening at the global scale. Right? Second, one of the things that I have learned is that when you jump into a new domain, it is very prudent to talk to experts as to what not to do. Right? And we have a collection of ecologists, biologists, conservationists, and weather forecast, climate expert people in the room. And I could not think of a better forum to kickstart this discussion today, to give you this seed of an idea that we have at Atria, saying, can we do something like this, right? And that's the reason I wanted to talk to you about this particular idea of EarthStack, right? So let's jump in and see, why are we talking about digital public infrastructure which may be beneficial for conserving our natural capital, right? You will see my language is more economics than biodiversity. I use the word natural capital. That's how economists think about biodiversity, right? And this is an interesting graph, and let's look at where we are in our journey. From 1970, across regions, there has been a consistent fall in the monitored wildlife populations. Right? Now, if you have been paying attention since morning, the results are not surprising. You will see that the Latin American countries have had the highest fall in biodiversity since 1970, right? And Africa to some extent, and Asia and Pacific. Part of it is because the tropics, as Professor Shanker said, are very rich in biodiversity to begin with. But part of it is also that a lot of deforestation has happened in these areas, and there has been an extensive increase in cropland. The agricultural spaces that we are growing to kind of make up for the food requirements of the population of the world, which is currently as close to 8 billion and is going to reach 10 billion by 2050. Right? So there is no doubt that we are seeing immense fall in monitored wildlife, right, which I use as a proxy for biodiversity. But there is variation and there is consistent fall. I think where we need to stop and take a pause and ask ourselves is, what next? Right? And if you think about it, it's very obvious that what happens next will strongly depend on what we do as a human civilization. Right? It's very clear that this is where we are. Right? And if you start thinking about this problem from probably an economist viewpoint, or zooming out and thinking what's been happening and how do we solve this problem, one of the things that you realize is that a big part of the problem is the Industrial Revolution. Now, Industrial Revolution was beneficial for a wide variety of reasons, right? But we must acknowledge that it also created several problems. And the best way to kind of think about this is that we have borrowed from the future to pay for the present. Right? The technology that we have created for economic growth actually worked by degrading the planet's health. Right? And it is imperative on us now to break this pattern. So the question then becomes, how do we achieve sustainable economic growth while uncoupling it from environmental degradation? Right? And how do we do that? Well, I submit to you that the problem is that our economy today does not correctly price natural capital. That is the root of our problems, right? And what we are seeing, the challenges that we are seeing, whether it's climate change or biodiversity loss, are actually symptoms of the underlying problem to saying that the economy does not really assign value to things like clean air, clean rivers, clean water, and even non-human life form. And therefore, the question that I would like to put forth on the table is saying that the problem is, how do we integrate the planet's natural capital into our economy? Right? And since it's a little abstract, let me give you a concrete example so that it becomes real for you. Right? It's well known that one of the primary challenges of biodiversity loss, or one of the primary causes rather, of biodiversity loss is the loss of habitat. Right? Once you have deforestation or growth of agriculture and cropland, you lose the species which were living there. Right? Well understood, well known that as you lose the habitat, you lose the species. Now, if we do nothing, right? If we do nothing and we continue, and you project out what's going to happen from here on till 2050, right? What you see is that there is going to be intense habitat loss for species, and as you can see in the diagram, the species loss will be predominantly in Central and South Africa, Latin America, and also, of course, Asia, South Asia, and India. Right? So, if we do nothing, the loss of biodiversity caused by the loss of habitat, which can in turn be attributed to deforestation and growth in agricultural areas, cropland, will continue like this. What is interesting for me as looking at this from a game theory perspective or institution design or a computer science perspective is that we have also studied what are the potential solutions to this problem. Right? And here are the 4 solutions that have been studied extensively. Right? So, if we don't do anything, the cropland will expand by 2050 to about 3.35 million kilometers square. Just to give you an idea of how much space that is twice the area of India and Germany combined. That much how will the cropland will expand into natural habitats. So, we lose about 3.35 million. If we can optimize trade, what do we mean by optimize trade? Basically means that instead of growing the cropland in sub-Saharan, in Africa and Latin America, we move that agriculture to another part of the world. That's what we mean by optimizing trade. We can reduce that amount that we will lose to cropland and preserve that habitat. If we adopt healthy eating habits, if you're somehow able to wand a magic wand and change the eating habits of people to move more towards plant-based diet, you will have even smaller requirements for increasing cropland and preserving habitat and therefore preserving biodiversity. If you were to increase the agricultural yield, then you will save some more cropland. Right? And if you are able to reduce the amount of food wastage, right, which is both happens because the farmer harvests crop and is not able to sell it and it has to throw it away. If you can halve the food waste, then again you will save amount of cropland expansion. And if you do all of these together, you can actually reduce the cropland. Right? So, this is a concrete example of a set of potential solutions to a problem that we understand. Right? What is interesting is that we know the problem, we know the solution, and yet we can't solve the problem. And this is where it gets interesting for us saying, okay, what's going on? Right? The problem is known, the solution is known, so why can't we solve the problem? Right? And this is a slide that I took from a talk by Nandan Nilekani, and he talks about the challenge of coordination. Right? And the best way to understand challenge of coordination is anybody who has ever organized a meeting knows how difficult it is to get everybody to agree on when the meeting will happen, right? Because the time slots don't match. And that's the challenge of coordination at a very small scale. You can say that's the challenge of coordination as the business scale. Now, try to get a city to agree to something, or try to get a country to agree to something, and then try and get the globe or the planet to agree to something. And what you realize is this is a very hard problem. The coordination that you need to solve these global problems like climate change and biodiversity loss are fundamentally coordination problems at a scale that we have not solved before as a civilization. Right? And there are different costs that we talk about when we talk about coordination costs. Right? But I think the important thing is that at planetary cost, these costs are the primary bottlenecks for actually adopting solutions that we know that we need and we know that we can use. Right? And the digital public infrastructure, that's what I started my talk about, whether it's UPI, whether it's Aadhaar, are actually a set of technologies which are ideally suited for solving coordination problems at scale, right? And that's why one of the things that we want to do at Atria is to kind of think about extending the India stack to something we call Earth stack, right? And the idea of Earth stack is to take a digital public infrastructure to solve global coordination problems which have huge sustainability impact, right? What do we mean by Earth stack? Well, Aadhaar and DigiLocker are great examples of how you give identity and store information about individual citizens, right? Now, can we extend this idea to say, can we have an identity for every cell grid on Earth and capture the natural capital of that cell grid as an asset, right? We have seen talk about UPI, which is a payment interface for moving money across people. And there is already extensive talk about green credits, a program that India has recently launched for forest conservation. And there are talks about biodiversity credits. Can we create a UPI-like interface where we can enable peer-to-peer payments of such energy credit systems which are used for sustainability impact and biodiversity conservation? And lastly, some of you may have heard about something called the account aggregator framework, which is another digital public infrastructure that India has built for sharing private data with consent, right? In this case, I think the important thing is to think not or less about privacy and more about verifiability. Because the moment you start to bring in economic solutions to biodiversity conservation and start talking about moving value across different parties, then what you need is a layer which kind of proves that there is biodiversity in a particular geographical area, or this biodiversity has been conserved, or an action has been taken to reduce the expansion of cropland, for example. So that's the layer that we are talking about. Think about it as a solution which enables countries to value their natural ecosystem as part of the national wealth, as a way that industries can use to pay for economic environmental services using whether it's habitat loss or emissions. Think of it as the ability to pay individuals who are impacted because of the expansion of animal-human conflict, and ability to pay them for their efforts and for their sacrifices, right? But that's where we are positioning EarthStack. Let me finish by talking about what we are doing at Atria University. We are taking small steps to build out this stack. Of course, the endeavor is large, right? The first project that I want to bring to your notice, which we are kicking off soon, is the interspecies economics. We see this as a building block for EarthStack, which tries to extend the notion of giving identity and agency to non-human species, right? The second project, which will be under Dr. Rajivan, who talked earlier in the day, is trying to combine hyperlocal weather forecasting with the United Nations digital public infrastructure and agricultural information to make real-time agricultural recommendations. And the last one, which is in collaboration with the Energy Science Department at Atria, is about using the India stack to enable peer-to-peer trading of renewable energy, right? I'll finish by saying this is a big vision, right? And of course, we will need to collaborate. We look forward to that from audience today. I'll stop here and happy to take any questions.
Guys, do we have any questions here?
Hello, Praphul. It was such a nice talk. So my question is, like, if you are talking about this art stack and digital stack, so it needs lot of databases to store all those data and transfer the data. And in return, you need like lot of energy to like store those data. So according to you, it is not like against the ecology, like you are utilizing much more energy for this.
Well, yeah, fair point. There is, let me just extend this question, right? There is an extensive debate going on about AI today, right? Because a lot of the AI that we are using, right, if you have used ChatGPT, uses huge amounts of energy, right? And the generic debate is about whether the value created by AI is more or the loss that we are suffering from the perspective of consuming energy is bigger? There are a couple of ways to answer that question. One is, don't burn fossil fuels to create energy, right? Use solar energy. So that's part of the answer, to kind of say energy does not necessarily need to mean climate impact, because we have renewable energy now, right?
But still, it's like the solar energy is not yet like much more utilized in India.
True.
So in India perspective, like we have Aadhaar card and DigiLocker, DigiYatra, so many digital like things happening in India, but India still depends on the coal-based energy. So how to like increase this renewable and make this thing like sustainable?
So I think I will let you talk to Paddy. Paddy is here somewhere. He will give you he will talk to you about how renewable energy should be a key focus area for decarbonization. But I think the answer is, I realistically don't think that you can stop any technological progress saying our energy source is limited. I think much more realistic to say we have to move to renewable sources of energy. I'll leave it at that.
Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, so we had a talk today.
Sorry, Professor Vashna is here. Go ahead, Paddy.
So we had a talk today in the morning about Professor Uma's talk on essentially doing an Aadhaar card for tigers, right? So how does your initial thoughts on how you will build on that aspect?
Yeah,
Just very high level thoughts.
I think we have more questions than solutions right now. Professor Saskia and me were talking during lunch, and something she asked has been a point of bother for me. Not every species can be thought of in terms of giving identity to an individual. Right? So first let me just get that out of the ground. There are species like tigers and dogs and elephants where individual identity is feasible. But once you get through insects, right, it's not even possible to kind of think about individual identity. If you looked closely at the presentation, we had two separate ideas there. The interspecies economics module that we are trying to build talks about identity at an individual level across species, and it's fairly suitable for the elephants and the tigers and the large mammals to some extent. Right? The Earth stack approach is completely different, recognizing that there's a large number of species for which individual identity is not possible. And the way we are kind of thinking about that problem is that the unit of analysis in that is a grid cell of Earth, a micro-Earth, if you may. Right? And if you can look at a micro-Earth and create a measure of how biodiverse this unit of Earth is, right, you can start to track it and make that the basis for what are now being called PES, Payment for Ecosystem Services. So I think there are two answers there. There's an individual unit, and then there's the Earth unit. I think because we thought about this quite a bit, right? I mean, you could say that I could make a honeybee unit, the bee cluster, make that a unit, but doesn't scale. It seems more hypothetical. So you have to either go the individual way or the micro-Earth unit way. I think that those are two answers that we have right now. But yeah, I mean, we don't have also answers by any means.
Okay, my question was really more on practical side, like what would be the time scale to complete this project?
Yeah.
I mean, your assessment now may be quite high, but this may be something like Human Genome Project also. Depending on the technology, the time scales may come down. Right. But as of now, what do you see?
So we have talked about this in the board. I have proposed 5 years. Mr. Sunder Raju has pushed us for 3. I have not committed to 3. We have taken 5 years as probably the target at which we will see. Now, I do want to say that we have to be slightly careful here. Aadhaar was conceived in 2010. And the set of services that built on top of it with UPI, with QR codes, with DigiYatra, all came slowly over a period of time. So the approach that we are trying to do this is to build small modules. right? So the last project that I talked about, which is peer-to-peer renewable energy trade, that is 12 to 18 months, right? That's a joint project between Energy Sciences and the Digital Technologies Group. Something like Climate LLM, which Dr. Rajivan and me are collaborating on, I was pushing for 24 months, he has been pushing for 18 months. So there are small projects which are here and now, and interspecies economics project, which is probably 3 years out, right? So these are small modules, it's not going to happen one fine day, and some of these we want to build on top of. For example, the United Nations Biodiversity Lab is something that we're going to use as a DPI rather than build.
Dr. Chandra, very nice talk. Any change we want to bring about collectively finally requires government support. Otherwise, it's just going to be beating around the bush. So what is the thinking of the Atria think tank about involving government, a champion in the government departments right from the beginning? Because you don't want to be doing all this work and they find some loop which may be not popular in the community, and they put a stop. That's exactly what happened to genetically engineered crops, genetically modified crops, because that can reduce your crop area for crop productivity in one of the slides that you showed. So any thoughts on this process?
I think the answer was on the last slide, collaborators welcome, right? So I think this has to be a joint effort. I don't think Atria can do it alone. We are actively talking to a wide variety of both researchers as well as the people who have built the India stack, that group. And if there is any way that you can help us, we would be more than happy to.
No, I was more looking at reaching at very high levels through your Atria board, to the ministers and to the officials and all of them.
I'm not the right person to
I remember in
answer
the previous conference you had the Minister for Forests and Environmental Affairs and the
Right.
ITBT and all of that.
Right.
So my request is to, I know it's difficult, but unless we involve them from the beginning and have a champion, a few
Right.
champions in those departments,
Sure.
it's going to be very difficult.
Understood. Point well taken, and we'll
Thank you.
take that into account. Yeah.
Thank you.
Very nice talk, sir. I'm not tech savvy. I'm a professor in chemistry department. Just I got a doubt. So when it comes to species, and there are different species, they do migrations. So when it comes to migration, how, according to your tracking and all, how it helps?
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, even with something as simple as elephants who migrate across large distances, quantifying the biodiversity becomes a challenge, right? And something that we have been talking about, I think one of the approaches that we have seen is eDNA, which Dr. Uma talked about that she uses in her work. The eDNA continues to stay in the area even if the individual has migrated out. So that and satellite imaging data, those are the two data sources that we are relying on to be able to estimate the biodiversity of any part of the earth.
One more question, sir. Once it comes to natural habitat, do you think we are disturbing natural habitat due to your project?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. Can you repeat it?
So as of now, we are having the ID data and all. Is there any chances of data threatening, like data theft about the natural habitats?
Yeah, I mean, I see your point. I think there are ways to solving that problem. I will give you two answers. One is the United Nations Biodiversity Project, right? You basically give it to an agency which works not for profit and is a globally regulated entity to some extent. So you give it to a trusted entity like United Nations, or which is what the India stack way is, that do not aggregate data in one central location. Rather, you keep it decentralized, but enable a software layer where data can be exchanged on demand after consent is given, right? So that kind of is a different way to solve the problem. We are personally, when we are building out the Earth stack, or when you're thinking about this, we are thinking about this from the perspective of decentralization and not aggregating data in one place. But when data is available centrally in something like the Biodiversity Lab, then we basically just use that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Praphul, it's an excellent talk.
Thank you.
Because you come with the idea like earth stock and digital public infrastructure. So you need more support, that is what you are saying. So from NIAS, what we exactly working, the forestry and biodiversity using the earth observation data and the climate related, for example, CO2 and also above ground biomass. And also more recently we entered the human wildlife conflict data. It is a part of, previously it called as a e-governance. Now after 2014 meeting from the Prime Minister, they said it should be a G-governance. Means most of the, almost all the ministries should use the geospatial technology. So we have taken the 5 years of human wildlife data, means that is not from a one animal, the type of land cover damaged and property damage and how much money has been released towards the compensation and how much human wildlife conflict for killings and all. It's a very huge data in a geospatial data. So what is my suggestion is, we should have a collaboration and we can integrate this data so that the repetition of these works can be happen.
Absolutely.
Because in future, our past generation, future generation, they may work on the same plot. For example, he established a 1 hectare plot and the data is not in a digitalization form. Again, the repetition of data may happen. Like that, all human wildlife and whatever the geospatial, first digitalization of data, then geo-visualization of data, because geospatial technology only can solve the most of the problem. This is not my word. As per the essential biodiversity variables and essential climatic variable, out of 50, almost 60% of the variables from the can be achievable through the remote sensing and geospatial technology. So I'm requesting you to conduct a brainstorming session. So whatever the data we have, so we will have a common platform to share the data and do the solutions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We'll definitely reach out to you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Praphul. I request Dr. Varshney to give a token as an expression of the gratitude for the talk. I also request Dr. Nagesh to come give a token of gratitude to Dr. Varshney. As we reach the end of the talks scheduled for today, I request our Chancellor for the Atria University, Mr. Sunder Raju, to deliver the concluding remarks.
I think Professor Kartik captured it when he said, management sits. Now, the idea of having the Chancellor, first they've defined a label called Chancellor, because vote of thanks is given by someone you don't want him person around. You call him for the last action of the day, so to say. And because you've called the Chancellor, you define it as concluding remarks of what happened in the day. Really, but I think on a more serious note, this has been an amazing day of information, certainly for me. I think there's a wide variety. Started with Professor Varshney, kind of setting the range of what we will do. It started with, the interplay of climate change, agriculture, DNA, genetics, and so on. And he kind of either orchestrated the day, or it turned out that we found the right people to deliver different messages that integrated into one wholesome day. Certainly for the management person, this was an amazing learning day. I'm hoping and presuming that for each one of us, because we've got different prisms through which we see things, there was facets that we had not looked at, facets that opened our eyes, and facets that I think we will go back and look at and work on. Really, I think if that outcome has been achieved, I think the day has been a successful one. I want to also walk through what various people said. I tried, as we came to the end of the day, to try and recollect what each one had said. Didn't do a good job of it, but I'll pick out the important things, messages that each one of the speakers spoke about. When we started with, Professor Raman Sukumar. Really what I got out of it is, there is one thing that is through the thing. Where is the data? What is the timeline? If this is the only two messages we got out of that, talk on the variety of biodiversity and what happened in the space that he's working on with the Madhumile forest, the overarching thing was humans don't have enough data to make decisions. We make a lot of our decisions based on incomplete data sets. So collecting data is a very, very, very critical piece. And collecting data over a large timeline is an even more important critical piece, is what I got out of that conversation. Then we went on to, Uma Ramakrishnan. And interestingly, her presentation was very picturesque and beautiful, if you will. And the fact that she chose tigers as the area of her career, if you will, was lent to great pictures being shown for a layperson like me. But more importantly, the kind of work that is done from a genetic space was eye-opening, that you could actually go off and, at least at the mammalian and the reptilian level, be able to create the equivalent of an identity for non-human species, be they be plant or animals or mammals. Mammals are easier. There are different ways to address it, is what Praphul told us about insects and plants. But the way of creating an identity can be defined, needs to be defined, and in the process, we look at the larger earth rather than being very, very human-centric. That's the message that I think Professor Uma gave us. The other thing was a little more challenging for me, but because it was human-related, Professor Sasha I'm not going to attempt, spelling your last name because I'm not quite sure I'll get the pronunciation right, but it was very interesting that agriculture and human intervention is what a lot of the degradation is about. And I think that's the message that I got from that, and what we can do to make sure that human intervention is a lot more focused. In the attempt to eliminate pests, we eliminate, I'm trying to read it, parasitoids. Okay. There's a lot of vocabulary that I've tried to learn today. That's another thing that I've learned today, that there's so much vocabulary that you don't know in one specific area, so you can imagine what it is over many areas. But the fact is that humans are degrading it because, again, due to lack of knowledge, if you will, and we're degrading it in a space that is quite aggressive. Agriculture is quite aggressive intervention by human beings for human needs. And I think that's a critical piece of the learning that we will take away today. How do we ensure that we make sure that our interventions are controlled? Then we had Professor Kartik himself. Honestly, sir, other than looking at the lovely snakes and frogs, it was so varied in its thinking and spanned so much. Really, the only thing that I really learned was that the Western Ghats had segments, if you will, of peaks and valleys, and each segment had its own biodiversity spanning millions of years. And I think that was a learning, really, such a small, tiny area when you look at the entire Earth. And yes, it has so much diversity within that small space. And you can map 25 plus million years all the way to, decades. And that learning really, and it tells me the scale of all of this at an Earth scale. I can't even fathom what we're trying to do, because it doesn't matter how many of us get together, how many millions of us get together. I'm not even sure that we can find an answer that is right, that's complete, and will actually stand the test of time. So really, all this was a learning for me, and it kind of drives me to say, what now? And then comes along Praphul and kind of steals in some way what I used to talk about as this should be the vision and so on. And he comes off and says, we will do the Earth Stack. So I'm now calling it the Mission Earth Stack. And really, it is interesting that you've brought a perception of creating a platform on which every earthling or humanling, or whatever you want to call it, can participate in whatever fashion they can. And again, there's a multitude of ways of engaging with that, but defining that platform well enough that everyone can do it is quite a challenge. I thought I had kind of pushed you to say it is an 18-month or rather 3-year project, and we shook hands on that. And I was hoping that 6 months from now, I can crunch that, move it, stretch it back to 5 years, so I don't know what that means. Maybe it's the audience here joining hands will get it back to 18 months, because as Professor Washington was saying, all this is good, but are we talking of multi-generational timelines before we move here? And we've got 2050 facing us, and there are people who are saying, human extinction is around the corner, 2050 and beyond. There'll be so much of extinction that our survival will be a big question mark. Really, we've bought, I think you used the word, we borrowed from the future. We now need to figure out how to aggressively give it back. And I think I'm actually saying, let us collaborate together in whatever fashion. The future forward is Mission Earth Stack. As far as AU is concerned, I hope everyone here signs on, travels this journey, because we owe a responsibility to the future generations. Fortunately, we think at AU we're starting to have believers. Our own Vice Chancellor truly believes that climate change is conquerable, and he's driving it aggressively and pushing us all to say, let's focus, and get here. I think today is, in many ways, our coming out time, if you will, to say, this is what we want to do at AU. Let's all join hands, and together let's travel this journey, and hopefully, from here, get to a point that the human beings as a community will actually deliver on its promise that we're going to take care of the future. One last thing, because you spoke of human beings. Just some numbers that I read recently, this was a couple of days ago. If every human being takes care of 243 square meters of space, individual spaces, that's all we really need to look. That means if we can get all human beings involved in the process, each one needs to worry about conservation and sustainability in 243 square meters, the size of our house site or something like that. Can we find ways of making that happen? I mean, the easier thing is to say 243 square meters. The difficult thing is individual differentiated square meters. That's when it all integrates and makes it a very large problem. But I'm hoping that there's enough intellectual capability here, minus the management team, to make sure that we will promise ourselves as humanity that we'll move forward and create a sustainable future. Thank you very much.
Requesting everyone to come up here for a group picture.
Everyone, is it?